In this video, I will explain everything you need to know to do a request for repair, to fill out the form and to negotiate the request for repair, and even answer it with a seller response form. Now, both these forms were revised June of this year, 2022, and we'll go through it. And by the time this video is done, you should be pretty comfortable on how to negotiate a request for repairs. All right, so we start by putting a number 1 up here because this is the first request for repair. Then we'll put the date where we're drafting this form right here. By default, this amends the purchase agreement, so you can leave it alone unless you're adding this onto something else, some other form. And then you'll put the date of the purchase agreement, property address, buyer and seller. That's the easy part, okay, up here. Now, we get down to the actual request here. Section 1A, this is where a buyer requests repairs to be done from the seller. So you'll check 1A and you'll write in these lines items. I like to itemize it by numbers, and you'll write something like seller to repair hole in wall in kitchen, or something specific. You want to be as specific as possible. A lot of times I see agents and they'll write something like backdoor screen or kitchen window. And it's like they're implying that the seller knows, that everyone knows. Or they'll just mention something that's wrong, like kitchen window inoperable, okay? And so you've identified a problem, but you're not requesting specifically for an action to take place. So you need to say something like repair torn screen on back door, make kitchen window fully operable and functional, or something to that effect. But you're commanding the seller to perform an action to fix something. So make sure that you have some verbs in there. You're not just identifying problems. That doesn't help. If you can reference an inspection report, like repair torn screen on back door, item 33J of attached inspection, something like that, the more specific, the better. Now, if there's not enough room here, check this box, and then you'll date this list the same date you're filling this out, but you'll create another list. And that list I would just put on a Word document or some blank form. You just create a list, and then you on the top of that list, you can say list of items to be repaired, and you put the date, and that date on your list needs to match this date so that we know that that document has to do with this document. But this section 1A, this is where you're putting items to be repaired. Now, back in the olden days, the termite repair request was on the purchase agreement, but too many times a seller would say yes before they saw the termite inspection, and they would get some huge bill for like $20,000 in termite work, and they'd say, wait, I didn't agree to pay $20,000. And the buyer would say, oh yes, you did. It was on the purchase agreement. So rather than signing blank checks, now all that's pushed back onto the request for repairs so that we know that how much the seller is signing up for, because there's an inspection that's already been done. So everyone should have a copy of the inspection. And then if the buyer wants section 1 work, and this is going to be required by FHA and VA loans, conventional doesn't require it. Of course, there could be some random exception, but in general, conventional financing doesn't require a section 1 work to be done. You'll check this box here, section 1, and you'll put the date of the termite inspection and the name of the company that prepared the report. And this now includes section 1 repairs to be done by the seller. Do you want section 2, which is not very commonly done by a seller, but either way, it could be. So they added a section 2 on here. And there's some verbiage if the section 1 work is to be done, when it's supposed to be done. And there should be what they call a termite completion, which shows that the termite company finished this section 1 and or section 2 work. Now, if instead of repairs, the buyer wants money, then they check this box and then they write a number here. So maybe the seller maybe the buyer has concluded that repairs are $5,000, or that's what it would cost to have it done if they were to do it. Well, the buyer can ask the seller for $5,000 here. Okay, now here's another mistake I see made all the time. I see people write a list of repair items and then they put a number in here. And the buyer's agent is mistakenly saying, well, you can do A or C. What do you want it to be? Do you want to do all these repairs or all these repairs on the attached list? Or do you want to just give us $5,000? Well, the problem is that's not how this form is designed. It's not an or proposition. It's not A or C. It's all that you check here. So in theory, you could say replace torn or repair torn screen on back door and give me $5,000. So if you put items on 1A and a number on 1C, you're asking for both, not one or the other. One or the other, that should be discussed with the listing agent, and you should figure out before you do a request, are you asking for money or are you asking for work to be done? And that's what you put on this form, but you're not asking for one or the other. That should be done prior to doing this form. And down here, D, same idea. Now this is for a reduction in the purchase price. And a quick hint, side note, a purchase price reduction only makes sense on a cash purchase. If you're financing, asking for a seller to reduce a purchase price instead of a credit is not financially savvy. I've done the math in other videos and scenarios, and the break even's decades, sometimes over 100 years for it to make financial sense. So anyway, that's I'm digressing into a side note there, but if the purchase price needs to be reduced, this is where you're going to do it. So let's say you have a cash buyer. There's a lot of work that needs to be done. Well, that cash buyer can come back and say, you know what, after inspections, this only makes sense if you knock another $25,000 off the purchase price. So they put that here. And this is effectively renegotiating the purchase price, because that's what a request for repairs is. So this is just an addendum done in the middle of escrow under the understanding that this is the one chance the buyer gets to speak now or forever hold their peace. That's the understanding. But in terms of effectiveness, this is nothing more than a dressed up addendum, because the buyer can ask for changes in this form, in this addendum. And if the seller says no, then the buyer can walk, because there's a contingency. And that's the leverage the buyer has to go back and ask for stuff from the seller. Now, keep in mind, a seller does not have to respond to this. You can fill this out as a buyer's agent, send this over to the seller, and hear nothing from the listing agent or seller. And sometimes agents will call me and they'll say, well, my buyer submitted a request for repairs days ago. We haven't heard anything. And I tell them, well, follow up, of course. Make sure, but they're not obligated to do anything. They're not obligated to respond to this. They can just ignore the whole thing. And what's the consequence of ignoring it? Well, the buyer might walk, or the buyer might just say, okay, well, it was worth asking. And the buyer continues on with the sale. All right, if you're going to attach reports, so certainly a termite and property inspection, and if there's septic or if there's some plumbing or roof report or whatever, anything should be that any report done for the buyer to learn about the condition of the property, that should be written here, and there should be a checkbox that indicates such report exists. And that report should be included with this request for repair to the seller to inform them. Well, first off, the seller, but in the contract, the RPA, the buyer is obligated to deliver a copy of any and all inspections obtained. That's number one. But number two, it's good form, because again, the buyer wants to be specific and tell the seller, hey, you need to do this exact thing, and this should be the outcome. You need to make that window completely functional and operable, because right now it's stuck. So the seller needs to know as much as possible if you want the item to be repaired properly. There's a section about FHA and VA because in an FHA and VA appraisal, the appraiser may mention things that must be done prior to close of escrow in order to obtain that financing. So it's a lender requirement. And the deal can fall apart if the seller refuses. So if a seller says this is as is and the buyer says, well, I'm fine with taking it as is, but my FHA appraisal says that you must have something done, this helps the parties address what that required repair is in order to obtain financing. By the way, if you have questions about anything I talk about, just leave a comment and I'll answer it. All right, so there's a line here that if the seller agrees to all the buyer's requests, or even some of it, that the buyer removes an inspection contingency here, or we call it investigation. I use those words interchangeably. And there's an area to write an exception if you want to keep a certain investigation contingency, because the new RPA splits them up into several different. Inspection investigations is now split into several different contingencies. They itemized them out. Anyway, so if you want to keep certain contingencies, this is where it needs to be, because by default, if the seller signs, these contingencies are being removed. Or a buyer might just have a CR form, contingency removal form, removing all. And they're saying that basically, hey, seller, if you agree to everything I ask for, I'll remove all contingencies. And that's where the buyer's agent will check this box and include a CR form. Here's an expiration, just to add a little heat to it, to get the seller to move. Again, the seller doesn't have to respond though. And stipulation about if the buyer withdraws it. Buyer signs. Now, this is where the seller needs to respond. So after the buyer signs it, the buyer sends it to the listing agent. Now, the seller, in reviewing this, is going to agree to all. That would be easy. The seller just signs 1A and it's done. So in theory, the seller could check box 1A, sign there, and we're done. Partial, meaning some, not all, of course. So basically, the seller's agreeing to everything written above with the exception, and this just deducts the line items above. So maybe they agree to everything except termite repairs. They'll write that there. Or they'll agree to all 10 items the buyer asked for, except they will not replace the torn screen on the back door. So that's where they'd write it. And let's see. Now, a seller can add their own CR form. Maybe the buyer's agent didn't propose to remove all contingencies, but the seller is saying, well, I'll tell you what, I will agree to everything you asked for, but you need to remove all contingencies. And you didn't say that when you sent over your request for repairs. So now I'm agreeing, I'm checking this box, and I'm sending you a CR form removing all contingencies. Now, if this is too messy, because let's say the seller is like, well, I will do this, but I won't do that, and I will do this, and I won't do that, then the seller really needs to do now it's the RRRR form. I like to say quadruple R because it just sounds a little bit less weird, but it's an odd. So the request for repairs is the CAR form RR. The seller's response is the RRRR form. Now, again, if there's a lot of stuff going on here, it's easier for the seller just to do their own RRRR form and basically counter this out, if nothing more than to just clean it up, rather than saying, well, I will do item 1, but not item 2, and I will do item 3, but not item 4. And so that's the next form we're going to do, is the quadruple R form. We'll jump into that in a second. And then the seller can just flat out reject it. That happens too. And then the seller is going to respond by signing here. And typically, you're going to see, most of the time, you're going to see that there's going to be an agreement or the quadruple R form or a flat out rejection. And often, I don't see a lot of these rejections. because sometimes because again, the seller can just ignore the buyer's request. And if the seller is going to the point of ignoring it, then why bother sending this form back saying none? Sometimes when the buyer's agent and listing agent are communicating very well, they might have a conversation offline and say, look, your request is a mess. My seller doesn't want to deal with it, but why don't you, how about this? And the listing agent might say this: we're going to reject your request because it was a mess, or my buyer didn't like it, or it was supposed to be as is and you asked for 24 things. And then you're going to submit a new RR, and then we'll agree to that. But it's going to have a much smaller request list on it. So anyway, so that I'm just naming a scenario when that could be used. And when a buyer's agent submits a new RR, they're going to put number 2 here. So that way we know this is actually the second version of the form, as to not let things get mixed up. Okay. Now, if the seller does a partial agreement, that again requires a buyer to countersign for a second time. And because the buyer can say, well, no, I wanted all or nothing. So the seller has to get the buyer's permission a second time down here if they're doing a partial agreement. Partial agreement can be found, partial agreement's right there, 1B. So if 1B is checked, buyer has to go back and either agree to it or reject it. Now, if the buyer rejects it, we go back to square one and the buyer drafts a new request for repairs, and that is number 2. So again, anytime a second request for repair form RR is drafted, you need to there needs to be a sequential number here. So we did the first one, it didn't work out. Now we're doing number 2. Maybe that doesn't work out. Now we're doing number 3. And then, of course, the buyer would sign that they're either rejecting it or accepting it. Okay. Now let's jump over to the seller's response, the quadruple R. This is when the seller says, let me show you the exact thing they're going to check right there. When the seller checks this box number 2 and says, you know what, I'm not agreeing to everything, not even part of it. It's a mess. I'll tell you what I'm willing to do. And they might, let's say, for example, the buyer asks for 10 items. The seller might check this box, the quadruple R, jump over here, and do only one thing. Hey, I'm not doing the other 9 things you asked for. I'm only doing this. But this is where the seller counters it. And the seller's going to put number 1 because this is the first quadruple R the seller is doing. This is the easy part where you're naming the property, address, and the parties. And now this is where the seller can modify and counter the buyer's request for repairs. So we have seller agrees to everything except, and they can write that in there. Or instead of the repairs, they can credit the buyer a dollar amount, dollar figure, or offer a reduction in the sales price, or other. And that really should solve the problem because the seller's explaining what they're willing to do. Now, I've also seen it where a buyer will see this. By the way, I'll mention down here that this section right here, and you can read through it. This is again that CR form, because remember, the buyer can back out and get their deposit back until a CR form has been delivered, contingency removal form. So the idea is that if the seller's offering a little something like a repair or a credit, then the buyer needs to reciprocate that concession by removing their contingencies. So again, once repairs are agreed upon, that's when the buyer should remove their contingencies. Okay, so seller's signing here. Now, we come down again because just like the partial credit on the request for repairs or the partial repair, remember how one of the options was the seller agree to do some of the buyer's requests, and then the buyer had to sign a second time to approve that partial request? Well, same idea here, because the seller is countering. Now the buyer has to agree to it, and the buyer can agree to it as it stands, agree to it but propose a modification, or flat out reject it, and then make a new request for repair form, which is down here on number 3. So all this is a dressed up, super glamorous counteroffer that takes place. These are just a counteroffer type scenario that takes place in the middle of escrow with these request for repair verbiage templates. That's what all this is at the end. They're just counteroffers going back and forth. And then the buyer is going to sign that they either accept or reject. And then the seller, again, anytime any party makes a change, then the other party has to come in and then sign off agreeing to it. So seller agrees to buyer modification, or seller rejects the buyer modification, and the buyer can start over again. But anytime this request for repairs and then the quadruple R, which is the seller's response to request for repair, anytime that falls apart, the buyer can always go back to square one and do a new request for repair and add a new number there. So falls apart, go back, do a number 2. Falls apart, go back and do number 3. But the idea is this shouldn't have to go on too long. Excuse me, because a good listing agent, buyer's agent should be hashing all these details out. By the time this is done, that this form is completed, there should be a good idea of what's happening here by the listing agent, of what to expect from the buyer's agent, and by the buyer's agent getting a response from the listing agent, because both those agents should have talked to each other and said, this is what we were asking for. And listing agent might say, okay, well, seller will do this, but not that, but let's try this, or how about a credit instead? I mean, some of this needs to be hashed out prior to putting it on here. As a buyer's agent, you need to educate buyers. I'll end on this final note. Sometimes these, especially first-time home buyers, they treat a home, you have to remind them, look, this is a resale. This is a used home. This is not brand new. It's not going to be perfect. And if you give a huge list to a seller, it's like a slap across the face. So you need to educate buyers. What's crucial? What's essential? That is what should go on your list. It's not a wish list of 3 dozen items. And then as an agent, you don't want to do some long list and then just send it over to the listing agent without them knowing what to expect, because that's a slap across the face to the listing agent. I mean, if they're getting a huge list of 3 dozen items or something crazy, even sometimes just a dozen items, depending on how labor intensive those items are. So anyway, the point is that you want to communicate what you're sending to the listing agent, and the listing agent should be checking with the buyer. Hey, how's your inspection? How'd it come out? What are you guys thinking over there? What should we expect? And as long as this communication takes place, it makes all this a lot easier. Anyway, if you have any questions, please feel welcome to leave a comment. I'll be happy to answer. And I do hope you found this helpful. Thank you.